The JFK 35 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
President Kennedy is dead. The President of the United States was shot down by an assassin's bullet.
President and Jacqueline Kennedy left Washington, D.C. on November 21, 1963, for a 5-city, 2-day trip to Texas. Just over 24 hours later, the world changed when President Kennedy was killed in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. For those that lived through the moment, it felt like a personal tragedy, a moment too unbelievable to be real. 60 years later, when fewer and fewer people have a living memory of John F. Kennedy, it is sometimes the only thing a person might know about him. I'm Jamie Richardson, and in this episode, we will look at the days before and after that day in Dallas, learning where he went and why, and how the country and the world mourned the president. And let us begin Episode 7, The Torch Has Been Passed.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
On November 25, 1963, at 10:30 a.m., President John F. Kennedy greets Ludwig Erhard, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, at the White House. The recently elected leader is in the U.S. to discuss the West German-U.S. alliance. They are scheduled to meet for 1 hour and 40 minutes. After a state luncheon held in his honor, Erhard will place a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. At 8 p.m. on November 25, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy will give a state dinner in honor of Erhard at the White House. 118 people are on the guest list, and Boston filet of sole Verdi and roast sirloin Concord are on the menu. This is what Ludwig Erhard would have been doing had events in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963 had not taken place. His visit to the United States to see the president would have been just like other visits from other heads of state the Kennedy White House had overseen. White House staff were working on this state dinner when they first heard that the president had been shot. Nancy Tuckerman, social secretary for and friend of Jacqueline Kennedy, recalled in her 1964 oral history interview for the JFK Library about that moment.
And about 12 o'clock noon, I went to Sandy Fox's office. He was head of social entertainment, to seat the dinner. And there were approximately 120 people coming that night, and we set forth doing this, which always took about an hour and a half, and we were almost finished but not quite. I think we had about 10 more people to place when one of the men in his office came in and said, he said, someone has shot the president. And we were just, needless to say, so stunned. We just sort of stood there. The one thing I wanted to do was to go back into my office, because I figured we had a television set there and a radio, to find out what the true story was. So I went back there, and everybody was terribly excited, and they turned on the television. At that point there were no pictures, of course, but just as commentators saying, someone has tried to shoot the president. So I thought the best way to get information was to go to Jerry Bain, who was the president's Secret Service man. He hadn't gone on the trip, so I went down to his office, and he was on the telephone to Dallas, and I realized that I shouldn't be there at that particular point because they were discussing things which I knew were quite private. So I left and went back to the office, and we still had the television on, and everybody became frankly quite hysterical in this correspondence group that I discussed before, and they all came in and asked me what had happened, and they were crying, and I told them they had to control themselves and go back to their desks and sit there, and that we would tell them when there was any news. And while we were listening to the television, Tazewell Shepard, who was the president's naval aide, and he also had not gone on the trip, came by, and he just walked into the office and said, the president is dead. And then all I could think of was actually what had to be done.
November 22nd was a Friday, and some staff had gone home for the weekend. Many rushed back to work to help with all the activity that now descended upon the White House. That night, all corners of the White House worked long into the morning of the 23rd. The upholsterer supplied the black crepe that adorned the rooms to show that the White House was in mourning. White House florists sourced flowers for the platform where the president's casket would be placed. White House police managed crowds outside who came to pay their respects. The press office fielded questions from reporters from around the world. Ushers took care of family members that would stay at the White House for the next few days. Family and friends and staff began to research Lincoln's funeral to help the First Lady plan her husband's. With so much work to be done, many staff members reported that they didn't have time to feel grief or react to the impact of the death of a man they saw and interacted with frequently. They had a job to do. Nancy Tuckerman and Press Secretary to the First Lady, Pamela Turner, described the atmosphere in the White House in the immediate aftermath of the assassination.
I frankly don't remember the reactions of anybody because you were so
They all
busy.
functioned. This is what's incredible.
They all-
Everybody
completely.
carried on duty first before letting themselves go to what
Nobody
grief they
collapsed
felt.
in
No.
And you never
hysteria.
discussed anything. You never said,
Why we're doing this.
or who do you suppose shot the president, or who was doing what job. You just had so much to do that you never stopped to talk to anybody. At least that's the way I felt.
No, I have exactly the same impression that
You discussed
carried
it all
on
the
as
time.
this was the busiest time that had ever been in the White House, and everybody knew what they had to do. And yet, the only time you probably saw it was, I remember that first mass, which finally was set up in the East Room. And Mrs. Kennedy had, asked that whatever servants wanted to come should come with the family and friends. And that was the first time when I was standing between one of the doormen and a maid, and then you knew what they felt. But they had to leave the mass and then go in and serve at the breakfast afterwards. So they carried on in the most remarkable fashion.
Couldn't have been done otherwise, really.
As for the German Chancellor, Ludwig Erhard did come to Washington, D.C., but instead of going to Arlington National Cemetery to pay respects at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on November 25th, he attended the funeral of the fallen president. Instead of going to the White House for a black-tie dinner that same night, he went there to give his condolences to the First Lady. Chief of Protocol for the White House, Andrew Biddle Duke, was at the First Lady's side when Erhard spoke with her.
When Chancellor Erhard came through the line, Mrs. Kennedy greeted him and held him in the line, stopping the line, and asked him if he realized that that very evening she had planned her state dinner for him, and that as part of the evening, on November 24th, she had planned German music to play after dinner. And she said, under other circumstances, do you realize we'd be dining together tonight with German music playing here in this very house where we are today?
The sudden, violent death of John F. Kennedy was a moment that marked a clear before and after for not only citizens of the United States, but for citizens of the world. Everyone stopped in shock to process what had happened, what it could mean. It has become a moment frozen in time that frequently overshadows the purpose of that trip to Texas and what was going on in the country at that time. To put this all into context and to learn more about the events in the days that followed, I spoke with Fredrik Logevall, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian, who is working on the second volume of a biography of John F. Kennedy. Here's that interview now. Before we get on to Texas, I just wanted to set the stage a bit on where President Kennedy was towards the end of 1963. Kind of what is he thinking about for his presidency, for the future, looking into 64?
I think it's a mixed picture for John F. Kennedy in the fall of 1963 as he looks ahead to his re-election year. Because on the one hand, I think he has accomplished important things, maybe especially in foreign policy. Superpower relations are on a more even keel. He and Khrushchev have taken steps to reduce Cold War tensions. That's important. I think relations with Congress are somewhat better than they've been. He, I think, sees real progress on civil rights. I think he feels fundamentally quite confident about his re-election prospects in '64. On the other side, Vietnam, that fall is looking more and more problematic. It's an ominous problem, I think it's fair to say, for him. He and Jackie have lost a baby son. That's obviously really, really difficult for them. There are people who met with Kennedy in his final, say, month, who detected a certain somberness. Others didn't. But there is a sense, I think, in the fall that he's both feeling fairly good about his political situation, and yet there are looming problems for him, maybe in particular with respect to Vietnam.
And what brought him down to Texas? What was on his itinerary? Who was he going to see? Who was with him?
Well, so he was going to visit 5 cities, starting with San Antonio. Then it was going to be Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Austin. And of course, the last city he didn't get to. He was going in part, I think, to get to begin the process of his campaign for next year. It was, in other words, part of that early effort. Texas was important. He had barely carried Texas in 1960. I think he understood that he would need to spend time in Texas. Also, there are problems in the Texas Democratic Party. There's a split between Senator Yarborough, more on the left, more of a liberal, and Governor John Connally on the right, with Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, more or less on Connally's side. And so I think Kennedy is also going to try to heal that rift, or to bring the two sides closer together, partly for self-interested reasons. Let's be honest. I think he's doing it in part because he says, I can't have a Texas party that is split deeply if I'm going to have any hope of carrying this state, even with Lyndon on the ticket next year.
And you mentioned that they didn't have a huge edge, even though Johnson was from Texas in 1960, and the party kind of being in a little bit of disarray, like people not wanting to sit with each other, all kinds of very interesting moves. And how else was JFK in particular perceived in Texas through all of this kind of royal?
Well, I think in the state as a whole, my sense is that John F. Kennedy carried a lot of support. Opposition too. I think it's a mixed bag for him in Texas, but we should I think point out, we should acknowledge that there's also a lot of support for John F. Kennedy in various parts of Texas. At the same time, maybe in Dallas in particular, a very vocal, to say the least, a kind of ferment against Kennedy's candidacy in '64, against his administration currently, and that's a problem. And that's a problem that's perceived by people in the White House in advance of the trip. Kennedy himself, on some level, is aware that this agitation, this anti-Kennedy sentiment exists, but of course he proceeds to go anyway. And
you mentioned Dallas in particular. I did want to get there, and it was kind of known more as a right-wing city. There were flyers out about not wanting Kennedy there, and then Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, had been attacked. Was there any concern about this kind of level of dislike, let's say, of Kennedy?
Yeah, I think there is concern. Stevenson, as you say, Stevenson is about a month before Kennedy's arrival. Stevenson is there and is attacked by a kind of right-wing mob. So he's concerned about President Kennedy going. Senator Fulbright expresses worries about John F. Kennedy going to Dallas at this particular point in time. Others in the White House are also expressing misgivings. To what extent John F. Kennedy was aware of these concerns is a little hard to determine. Bobby Kennedy was aware of them. Bobby said, well, I'm not going to be able to prevent my brother from going. In fact, he plans to give a speech in Dallas opposing political extremism. So Bobby, we knows about it. But again, Kennedy waves aside whatever concerns he heard about and proceeds to make the trip.
And kind of a change from previous trips that Kennedy had made around the country. Mrs. Kennedy is there to join him. Was that a last-minute thing, or how did that come about?
Well, I think principally Jackie went along because her husband, Jack, asked her to go. He wanted her to go, and she went. She had been on a vacation in Greece following the death of Patrick. It had been a very restorative trip. She had really enjoyed the trip. She felt, I think, a little guilty about going, in part because there was a certain amount of negative publicity after she returned. And I suspect that when her husband then says, please go with me on this trip, we know that she readily said yes. In fact, she said something to the following effect: I'll campaign wherever you want me to campaign. And so she's added to the itinerary. She goes along. I think he feels, and many around him feel, that Jackie is a bonus. She is an asset on these kinds of trips. He wants her along, and she goes.
And then what are they doing as they arrive in Dallas? Where is he, Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy and the Connollys and Johnsons, where are they off to when President Kennedy is killed?
Well, so they're coming from Fort Worth. He spent the last night of his life in Fort Worth. He gave a speech early on the day of his death in a parking lot in Fort Worth for a large audience, about 8,000 people. And then he gives a speech to a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in Fort Worth. And it's after that they proceed to the airport for a 12-minute, 13-minute, very short flight to Dallas, to Love Field. And of course they then land, and the motorcade begins on its final journey.
It's I feel like this is going to be the episode in the season that everything's kind of converging on this moment in Dallas. So, the shots ring out, people don't know what's going on. What happens in the immediate aftermath of there? What do the people around him do? His administration, some of them are flying to Japan at this moment. Family, it's such a large moment.
Yeah, I mean, what can you say? It's hard, I think, for any of us who did not experience this or have not experienced something like it, to fully grasp what's going on. I think there was mass incredulity. I think people could not imagine that this had happened. And many of them refused to believe it had happened. Certainly for many minutes, I think there was a sense that this cannot be happening. To the leader of the free world, to our president in an American city, surely this must be some sort of mistake. And so I think it's hard, it's impossible for us to recapture what it was like for the people close to him who were either part of his administration, maybe who worked in the White House, or who were there as part of the Texas crew, if you will. You get some sense of this, it seems to me, when you watch on YouTube the clips that are now available and that give a sense of the real-time responses. When the networks learned about this, or they learned that something was happening, and they didn't have full details, but something terrible has happened to the President of the United States, I think it gives us a little bit of an insight into what the experience at the time in that terrible moment was like.
They all go back to Washington. President Kennedy's body is brought into the White House. And then they begin, to start planning a funeral and how to mourn him. How does that take shape? Who's participating? And it's hard to even think about in that moment to have the presence of mind of doing that.
Oh, totally. Well, there's no plan in place for a funeral, I think for understandable reasons. No plan in place. And so very important logistical work is done by two senior military officers in particular. And in the White House, important work is done by Sergeant Shriver, by Ralph Dungan, and by one or two others. But the chief planner, if I can use that phrase, is clearly Jackie Kennedy. I think it's the First Lady who makes key decisions about what kind of funeral it will be, what are the elements that she wants to see included. I think she, more than anybody else, brings this together in a moment that must be of just indescribable difficulty for her.
They both shared that love of history, and she pulled that into the planning. Can you talk about some of the references that she brought out?
Well, maybe the most important thing that she wanted to try to do was to see what could be learned from Abraham Lincoln's state funeral a century before. She knew, I think, that her husband admired Abraham Lincoln, that he was a kind of towering figure for him, and I think for her. Lincoln, of course, had also been assassinated, had been felled by a gunman's bullet. So there was that dimension. But I think she wanted to learn how things had been done in 1865. So, on that first night, they're pulling books from the Library of Congress at her direction to learn specific details about Lincoln's assassination, to try to incorporate those elements that would make sense in this context. That's a very important historical marker for her.
And then one other reference that they included was to JFK's Irish heritage. He had gone to Ireland, just a few months before, and he was really impressed with the Irish Army cadets, and so they were invited to perform. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Jackie had learned from President Kennedy, from her husband, that a memorial drill for the dead that had been performed for him by these cadets in Dublin during his visit had moved him deeply. He talked about this. And so she said, here in this hour of grief, I would like for those cadets to come and basically do that again at his funeral. And it's just an amazing story, which has been written about, how these cadets, many of whom had never traveled internationally before, come and perform at the funeral at the request of the First Lady. It's remarkable.
And then there are, as you say, that these Irish cadets, they're traveling for their first time perhaps, and you have other heads of state traveling internationally. Everybody who comes kind of descends upon DC, the heads of state and all of that.
If I'm not mistaken, about 82 senior dignitaries from abroad come for the funeral. And I think it speaks to something really important about this death, which is the global impact of John F. Kennedy's passing, which is something it's hard for us, I think, to fully recapture today. But in countries all over the world, people were distraught upon learning this news. And it was in some way as if their leader had passed. And maybe in some ways the common description that we give the American president, which is leader of the free world, on some level it holds. And even not just in, let's say, the West. We know, for example, that Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, wept upon hearing the news of John F. Kennedy's passing. And so the funeral, represented by so many people, so many leaders from so many countries, speaks to this, as does, I think, the response to the news of the assassination itself.
And I do want to get into that. While the coverage in Texas is happening, the funeral, this is being televised to the nation, which is kind of incredible, thinking this is the days before instant messaging. Telstar had just been launched a little while before. How did the American public kind of learn about this and learn as everything unfolded?
One of the striking things about this for me is how quickly Americans learn that something terrible has happened in Dallas. We don't have full details yet, but shots have rung out, shots have been fired at the president. It happens much more quickly than I would have imagined. It's not that different from today. Or let me put it this way, I think a few years before 1963, you would have had far more delays. I think it would have been much more difficult to get a grasp of what's going on. But technology has advanced so much by this point in the early 1960s that word can go out that this has happened, and not quite in real time, but in a pretty short order, people will learn, certainly in the United States, but to some degree also overseas, about this assassination. And that I don't think would have been possible even a few years before. As the days progress, so between the shooting and, say, the funeral, of course, Americans are glued to their television sets. The vast majority of homes now have televisions, and Americans are able to follow this in real time. And that's revolutionary. One could say that what really is born, in a sense, on November 22nd, 1963, is the idea of live television news, where you have an anchor who is reporting on what's happening, but you also let the camera, to a large extent, speak and describe for people in real time what's going on. This is not edited television. This is live television. That's something that, in a sense, comes into being on that terrible day, and of course is with us ever since.
Yeah, it was something I was very impressed or kind of surprised by. It's not, or something I had considered even, but there are letters to Chet Huntley, the NBC newsman here, and they're online now. And people were writing to say thank you so much for basically the 24-hour coverage, which it was kind of shocking to me to know that, oh, that was happening then, and for this reason. But
completely,
yeah.
And I think it was not something that people had experienced before, and an utterly revolutionary development.
And then, speaking of Chet Huntley, he said on air that it was an ominous and sickening popularity of hatred that killed Kennedy. And so did Kennedy's death and this statement that everybody would have seen have any kind of effect on the national psyche or what was happening in the country?
I think that it did have an important effect on Americans, that is to say, the assassination. And it goes in a couple of different ways. I think on the one hand, we see a coming together by Americans, a sense of national unity that arguably had not existed in the country since World War II. There is a kind of coming together. I'm sure there are people in scattered parts of the country who are celebrating John F. Kennedy's passing, but broadly speaking, I think you see a great deal of unity. On the other hand, I think that, and maybe this was not manifest so quickly, but I think a disillusionment with politics, a certain amount of cynicism that I think begins to flow from this experience, that is then deepened by later developments, maybe especially the war in Vietnam, mistrust and distrust in our institutions, that I think flows, again, has numerous causes, but in a sense can be said to have also been in a way born on that day.
I think as somebody who's grown up, Reagan was president when I was born, and so I've kind of grown up in this post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era, and it's really hard to imagine that. And thinking, when you talked about the 1960s, or the 1960 campaign, the parties were close, and that's unfathomable now. So I think it's hard to think about the before, especially being, the age I am now.
Yeah, I think it is. I can just imagine, because I'm older than you. I think the other thing that is related to this, which is, I think this is worth noting. I think what we sometimes lose sight of today is the degree to which Kennedy, not just in death, but in life, was a kind of larger-than-life figure, and was somebody who had an unusual amount of support across the political spectrum, which is to say that many Republicans, again, both in life and in death, I think supported him. I think he offered an inspirational message that cut across party lines. And that resonated with people in 1962, in 1963, and then, of course, as people thought about him after his passing. I mean, I think it's telling that far more people claim to have voted for John F. Kennedy than actually did so. And they actually began making that claim before his passing. So in the summer of 1963 already, you're seeing self-reporting that gives him a higher vote total percentage by a considerable margin than was actually the case. So there was something about Kennedy himself and his message that I think speaks to this point about how Americans responded to his death.
But then kind of going back, thinking about, again, the parallels of today, or the kind of perpendicular lines of today and yesterday, that popularity of hatred that Chet Huntley said, also really resonated, especially now. And it is also incredible, as much as things have changed, there is still so much that's, that things weren't that different, but they were that different.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know that I have a sort of a good response, Jamie, except to say that I agree with you that there is that things have changed, and yet you also see the degree to which there's continuity and the degree to which they have not changed. It's clear that John F. Kennedy, in the last year or two of his life, worried about extremism in the country and expressed concerns to aides about how to respond to this. What could he, as president, do from his bully pulpit to address this, to try to reduce the temperature, lower the temperature, reduce these tensions? I suppose the difference might be that in 1963 we were still talking about a fringe. It was a very vocal, very belligerent, virulent group of Americans, comparatively small, but he was concerned about these groups at the time.
Thank you. And then I think the one thing that's hard to escape when talking about the assassination is the idea of conspiracy theories. And we're in the 60th anniversary now, and there's so many ideas, you see on social media all the time of various theories. I'll just leave it at that. But what makes this event so prone to this kind of...
Well, I think there's something deeply consoling about conspiracies, which is why some people are drawn to them. Because it speaks to maybe a basic human need for, great events to have great causes. Big things happen, there must be a big reason why this happened. And I think we struggle as human beings to imagine or to acknowledge that a major development like this could happen for a fluky reason. And so I think you see a direct relationship, I suppose, between the momentousness of an event and the desire for people to believe that there must be some cabal, or at least group of people who are responsible for this. Probably adding to this tendency to want to see a conspiracy with respect to the Kennedy assassination is, I think, the fact also that Lee Harvey Oswald is himself killed soon thereafter. And there are various developments that are particular to the killing, to the developments on the 22nd of November, and then for the next several days, that add a certain amount of fuel to the fire. One could say that certain mistakes by the Warren Commission, or at least in terms of how they handled what they did, have also added fuel to this idea.
And one thing I actually wasn't planning on asking, but there's been lots of talk, the JFK files have come out, most of the papers are out. Is there anything that's of note, or any, people want the smoking gun, but is there at this point, or is it just...
Based on what I've seen, I'm not seeing smoking guns, even a single smoking gun, in these recent revelations, in the materials that we have been receiving, let's say, over the last few years periodically. They enrich the story in some ways, they add a nuance here or there. I haven't seen anything that is of great significance. Perhaps there's something there in the materials that we haven't yet seen. I'm somewhat skeptical, but that's what I would say about the stuff that's been released so far. I had one other thing. On the morning of his death, the Dallas Morning News had an ad, 22nd of November, which was a vehemently anti-Kennedy ad, accused Kennedy of being soft on communism, which meant that he was disloyal. A very hard-hitting ad was in that morning's paper in Dallas. It is said, this is reported by William Manchester, for example, that Kennedy read that paper in his Fort Worth hotel room and said to Jackie, remarked to her how easy it would be for someone to kill a traveling president. I don't have, so far in my research for my biography, I don't have verification of this. It's reported in William Manchester's book. It's an absolutely stunning assertion.
There's also, I was reading his speeches from when he's in Texas, and the night before he's at the dinner for that representative. I can't think of his name.
Yeah, I can't either.
But he says, I want him to, I asked him to stay on, he wants to leave, but I asked him to stay as long as I do. I don't know how long that is. And then the next day it's this, how quickly life can change.
His remarks planned for the Dallas Trade Mart. So these are remarks he never got a chance to give, because that's where he was going to speak next. It included a remarkable section on the need for reasoned discourse in American politics, and suggesting that if we don't commit ourselves, all of us, to arguing from reason, arguing from good faith, we're going to be in serious trouble. And, he says in that speech, or would have said in that speech, that we can't expect that all people will listen to reason, but we can hope that fewer of them will believe in nonsense. In a world full of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by learning and reason. Or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain popular ascendancy, and with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to this nonsense.
President Kennedy's body lay in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, where approximately 250,000 people paid their respects. On the 24th, a ceremony was held, where he was eulogized. One of the eulogies was delivered by Mike Mansfield, Senate Majority Leader from Montana. He offered a poetic tribute to both the President and the First Lady.
There was the sound of laughter, and in a moment, it was no more. And so, she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a wit in a man, neither young nor old, but a wit full of an old man's wisdom and a child's wisdom. And then, in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a man, marked with the scars of his love of country, a body active with the surge of a life far from spent, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a father with a little boy and a little girl, and the joy of each in the other, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a husband who asked much and gave much, and out of the giving and the asking wove with a woman what could not be broken in life, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands and kissed him and closed the lid of the coffin. A piece of each of us died at that moment. Yet in death he gave of himself to us. He gave us of a good heart from which the laughter came. He gave us of a profound wit from which a great leadership emerged. He gave us of a kindness and a strength fused into the human courage to seek peace without fear. He gave us of his love that we, too, in turn, might give. He gave that we might give of ourselves, that we might give to one another, until there would be no room at all for the bigotry, the hatred, the prejudice, and the arrogance which converged in that moment of horror to strike him down. In leaving us these gifts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States, leaves with us. Will we take them, Mr. President? Will we have now the sense and the responsibility and the courage to take them? I pray to God that we shall, and under God we will.
President Kennedy's death stunned a generation, but it would not be the end of the story. In the 60 years since mourners said farewell to the 35th president, his legacy lives on in the work of others who came after him.
Let us begin. The work we have in front of us is necessary, and we had better get started. And it's not going to be wrapped up in a nice bow by the time I'm done doing the work, but keep going. Please keep going, because it's about all of us and humanity being in a better position in the end.
Next week, in our final episode, we will look at how JFK's ideas remain relevant today as a new generation of leaders picks up his torch.